Thank you. Happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I now recognize Director Miller to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Rogers, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the global counterterrorism environment and to highlight the tireless work of the professionals of your National Counterterrorism Center. I'm truly honored and humbled to lead such an extraordinary group of patriots. As my statement for the record reflects, today's terrorism threat to the United States and our allies is less acute but more ideologically and geographically diffuse, emanating from more groups and more places than it did in 2001. ISIS and al-Qaeda operate in more than 24 countries worldwide. Iran and its Shia allies increasingly threaten U.S. interests overseas, and lone actors, inspired by a range of ideologies, pose the primary terrorism threat on U.S. soil. Our focus remains defeating al-Qaeda, its affiliates, and other terrorist actors while defending our shores from terrorist entry. We believe this threat picture will only grow more complex over the coming year as technological advances, changing geopolitical dynamics, and instability resulting from a global pandemic create more opportunities for terrorists to benefit. However, the U.S. and our CT partners worldwide can exploit some of these same dynamics to our advantages. The complex landscape requires thoughtful responses that evolve along with our adversaries, and we apply the lessons that we've learned over the last 19 years to adapt for the future. At the National Counterterrorism Center, we are innovating new ways of doing business to ensure we are best aligned to connect the dots amid a flood of ever-changing information. Through technological innovation and organizational realignments, we are positioning ourselves to mitigate the threat of today and preempt the threat of tomorrow. To do this, it will require greater resources to enrich our terrorist identities analysis and enhance our ability to detect and prevent terrorist travel to the United States. We also will need to invest in new data science and information technology solutions to optimize how we harness information available from our interagency partners to combat the threat. In addition to adaptability, an evolving terrorist threat requires vigilance, especially as other national security priorities eclipse counterterrorism in prominence and the U.S.'s physical footprint in key jihadist theaters shrinks. We believe that the changing national security framework and priorities only reinforces NCTC's mandate to serve as the government's lead agency for counterterrorism threat information and analysis. As our interagency partners work diligently to allocate resources to address the full scope of national security challenges, we remain focused, laser-focused, on leading the government CT enterprise to guarantee that we maintain relentless pressure on terrorist networks and preclude them from creating sanctuaries from which they can plot and project combat power. That is the central lesson learned from our 19 years of experience in this global war on terror. Nearly 2 decades after 9/11, it is now more important than ever that the NCTC remains positioned to lead the fight against terrorism by building on its legacy of vigilance and adaptation to prepare for the future. I am confident that our integrative and agile model has revolutionized how the U.S. addresses transnational threats. Our approach is a no-fail mission and is one that remains worthy of emulation across the federal government. But perhaps most importantly, it has allowed us to uphold our sacred commitment to protect and serve the American people. In closing, thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to your questions.
I thank the witnesses for their testimony. I remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel. I'll now recognize myself for questions. Director Ray, can you, for the sake of the committee, identify what organizations propose the greatest threat from a domestic standpoint here to the homeland? Is it right-wing extremists, or is it left-wing, or what does your reports reflect?
Mr. Chairman, we assess that the greatest threat to the homeland, to us here domestically, is not one organization, certainly not one ideology, but rather lone actors, largely self-radicalized online, who pursue soft targets using readily accessible weapons. And those include both domestic violent extremists of a variety of sorts, as well as homegrown violent extremists who are motivated by foreign, jihadist type sources. Those two groups, those two categories as a whole, provide the greatest challenge and threat to us here at home, partly because, and you've often heard the expression in the past, the importance of connecting the dots. Well, if you compare the threat I just described to the sort of al-Qaeda sleeper cells of old, that group, the sleeper cells, you've got a group of people colluding, conspiring, fundraising, planning, preparing, communicating. So there's a lot of dots out there to connect if the intelligence community and law enforcement know where to connect, and it usually occurs over a long period of time. These people, both categories, the domestic violent extremists and the homegrown violent extremists, they don't have a lot of people they're working with. They don't take a lot of planning and preparation. They can go from radicalization to mobilization in weeks, if not days. And so the challenge of connecting the dots, working with NCTC and our other partners, is that much greater because there are that many fewer dots to connect and that much less time to do it. So the time, as the experts say, from flash to bang is that much more daunting. So that's why that's the biggest challenge to us here in the homeland.
So when we hear officials say Antifa is the biggest threat on the left, are they being correct?
Well, we don't really think of threats in terms of left and right at the FBI. We're focused on the violence, not the ideology. Our domestic violent extremists include everything from racially motivated violent extremists, which we've talked about here in this committee before, I think when I testified last year, for example, all the way to anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists, and that includes people ranging from anarchist violent extremists, people who subscribe to Antifa or other ideologies, as well as militia types and those kinds of.
Right. Well, I think what I'm trying to reflect on is we hear from time to time that this organization, by name, we need to investigate. The secretary designee, if he was here, he would get asked this question, but he's not. He asked for an investigation of Antifa because they were the greatest threat to the homeland. And if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that it's really not organizations so much as it is ideology. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that's what I heard.
I appreciate that. We look at Antifa as more of an ideology or a movement than an organization. To be clear, we do have quite a number of properly predicated domestic terrorism investigations into violent anarchist extremists, any number of whom self-identify with the Antifa movement, and that's part of this broader group of domestic violent extremists that I'm talking about, but it's just one part of it. We also have the racially motivated violent extremists, the militia types, and others.
Thank you. Can you tell me if, as of this date, you have information that Russia is trying to influence the election for 2020?
Yes, I think the intelligence community's consensus is that Russia continues to try to influence our elections. primarily through what we would call malign foreign influence, as opposed to what we saw in 2016, where there was also an effort to target election infrastructure, cyber targeting. We have not seen that second part yet this year or this cycle, but we certainly have seen very active efforts by the Russians to influence our election in 2020 through what I would call more the malign foreign influence side of things. Social media, use of proxies, state media, online journals, et cetera, an effort to both sow divisiveness and discord. And I think the intelligence community has assessed this publicly, primarily to denigrate Vice President Biden and what the Russians see as kind of an anti-Russian establishment. That's essentially what we're seeing in 2020.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the ranking member for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Ray, the Department of Justice has recently announced many FBI investigations that led to the arrest of Chinese nationals conducting highly sensitive research in the United States that have been found to be connected to the Chinese military. The growing number of these types of cases and non-public details of those arrests raise alarm bells for me. I'm introducing legislation this week to address China's efforts to circumvent our existing vetting procedures and take advantage of our open and world-renowned education research institutions, particularly those that are taxpayer funded through government grants. What is the significance and the prevalence of this threat?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the very end of your question.
The Chinese nationals who are using our educational facilities for their research and stealing our intellectual property. What's the threat, significance of it in your view?
So the Chinese view themselves as in an international talent war, and they recognize that American innovation and research is the envy of the world and frankly the envy of China. And when they can't innovate and research themselves, they send people over here, in some cases legitimately, but in many cases not, who engage in intellectual property theft, taking information, American research, and bringing it back to China to advance China's national security goals, which has the perverse effect, since a lot of this research is taxpayer funded, as essentially the perverse effect of having American taxpayers funding China's advancement at our expense.
What can Congress do to help you combat that threat?
Well, certainly we appreciate the Congress's allocation of resources to our counterintelligence efforts. That's an important part of it. I think I publicly acknowledged that the FBI now has over 2,000 counterintelligence investigations related to China, by far the biggest chunk of our counterintelligence portfolio. And we are opening a new Chinese counterintelligence investigation about every 10 hours. Wow. And so the scope and scale of this threat is really breathtaking. And we need as many resources as we can to help everybody tackle it. But it's not just a government problem. We need to work with the private sector. You mentioned the academic sector. I will tell you I'm very encouraged by the response we've gotten from both the private sector and, frankly, the academic sector lately. I think people in this country are starting to wake up to the threat and voluntarily undertaking appropriate measures. So the Congress can be very helpful in kind of raising awareness, both when you're all at home in your districts, but also through your work here in Washington in highlighting the importance of the threat and communicating, in effect, back to the Chinese that this is an issue that it's bipartisan, that all Americans care about, and that we're not going to tolerate anymore.
So you do believe that the academic sector is sensitive to this?
Well, yes. It varies, I will tell you, significantly from university to university about how sensitive and how cooperative with us they've been. But I think this is frankly one of the bright spots over the last couple of years. We've had quite a few universities. I've been to all 56 FBI field offices, and I will tell you, I'm struck by the number of offices where universities that 3 or 4 years ago wouldn't have wanted an FBI agent anywhere near campus, to some that now have office space set aside for our people. And I think that's it's not just because they're idealistic and believe in the country, I hope, but rather it's recognition that the information that's being stolen is their information. So it's about protecting their research, their professors, their hard work, frankly. And I think the more of that we can have, the better off we'll be, because the FBI certainly can't tackle this alone.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the young lady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. To both of the witnesses, we thank you for your presence and also your service to this nation. Director Wray, the FBI on May 30th, 2019, issued the Intelligence Bulletin on Anti-Government Identity-Based and Fringe Political Conspiracy Theories, very likely motivate some domestic extremists to commit criminal, sometimes violent activity. I think you focused or made the point today in your testimony that you act more toward the ideology, or you don't investigate ideology. You are determined to assess the threat to the United States. So I'm interested, QAnon activity has resulted in arrests of persons planning to carry out violent acts based on the nonsense spouted in web forums and social media that form the core of QAnon beliefs. How do you characterize that organization?
How do I characterize QAnon?
QAnon activity has resulted in arrest of persons planning to carry out violent acts. How do you assess that organization as it relates to violent acts?
So we view QAnon as essentially less of an organization and more of a sort of a complex set of conspiracy theories. And certainly we have had cases that properly predicated cases involving violence, where people have been motivated by some of those conspiracy theories. But as you said, we don't investigate the ideology or the conspiracy theory itself. I don't think we've seen lethal attacks involving that kind of motivation, but we have certainly.
So your investigations would be driven based upon any violent acts?
Correct. Violent. We no matter what ideology or belief it is of domestic violent extremism, we look at three things: one, violence or a threat of violence; two, a federal crime, obviously; and then third, the motivation that fuels it. If we have to have those three things to open an investigation.
Black Lives Matter was organized shortly after the tragic, senseless death of Trayvon Martin. Young people took to the streets asking for justice. They have obviously continued their fight for justice, and particularly in the wake of police shootings of African-American men, and most recently, of course, George Floyd, my constituent, and Elijah Blake in states in this country. Do you see, just on the name of Black Lives Matter and the basis of their organizing, them as an extremist group intending to turn America into a socialist nation or to destroy America?
We don't express a view on the sort of political organization itself of Black Lives Matter. If there were people who follow that group or who adhere to that ideology who were then to, based on that ideology or anything else, to commit violent criminal activity, then we would approach them just like we would anyone else.
But you're no longer pointing to black identity groups.
Well, I think what you're referring to, and we had some good conversations in the past about this, in 2017, there was briefly a product or a category that the FBI came up with that predates me about
Director Ray,
black identity extremism.
Right. I just want you to say yes or no. The reason is because my time is short and I appreciate the work. I'm familiar with it. The point I'm trying to make is that just the existence of Black Lives Matter and their advocacy for justice is not determined them to be disruptive socialist groups trying to destroy the nation. You have not characterized them in that way.
We don't characterize them one way or the other, no.
Have you seen any excessive violence that can be attributable to Black Lives Matter as opposed to any other groups that may be involved in violence?
I can't think of one sitting here right now. Certainly, we have had racially motivated violent extremist cases involving African American defendants who have pursued violence against, say, law enforcement, and whether any of those cases involve some reference to Black Lives Matter. Sitting here right now, I can't recall one, but we certainly have had cases of the first category.
As you've had cases with white individuals as well, with
Absolutely.
violence against officers.
Absolutely.
In particular, the one in Oakland, California, individuals Carrillo and Justice were known to have been the culprits in the shootings. Boogaloo Boys and Proud Boys, those individuals were not involved in protests, to your knowledge, as Vice President Pence indicated that they were involved in protests. These were white individuals who unfortunately tragically shot officers, Dave Patrick Underwood and another one. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I'm familiar with the case.
Those were not,
Gentlelady's time has expired.
were those protesters?
Well, on the Carrillo case, I don't think my recollection is there was no evidence that he was participating in the protests himself. I think there was information that he capitalized on the protest as a setting or a medium for which he could commit the tragic attack on the FPS officers that you referred to.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman and the panelists. For the record, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank the Department of Homeland Security and Secretary Wolf for actively and personally participating in the recovery supervision of my district after Hurricane Laura. Secretary Wolf was on the ground fast, and he's been personally at my avail. I regret that we were not able to work out his appearance here today, but I do appreciate his service and the direction he's given and the personal assistance he's given to my office in the wake of Hurricane Laura and the devastation we've suffered there. Director Ray, thank you for being here today. Good sir, and I'd like to talk to you about election security. The National Counterintelligence Security Center, the NCSC, released a statement last month outlining China, Russia, and Iran's effort to interfere with the upcoming presidential election. You also mentioned in your written testimony that foreign adversaries are attempting to sway U.S. voters' preferences and perspectives, to shift U.S. policies, and to increase discord in the United States, and ultimately to undermine the American people's confidence in our election process. Can you share with us regarding social media platforms, which is primarily the means by which this interference effort is being pushed? How is the FBI working with the social media platforms to ensure our election security and to minimize fake profiles and foreign influence in the attitudes and perspectives of the American people?
Well, Congressman, thank you for the question. You are correct that we are working increasingly closely and have been building over the last few years in our working with the social media sector in particular, but also other kinds of technology companies to thwart the malign foreign influence threat. I guess the best way to describe the way that works, and this is really one of the greatest improvements that has occurred in our collective defense against election interference over the last few years, we will take leads that we have, information that we have, work very closely with some of the key social media companies. We feed them information, and they are able to take action on their platforms using their terms of service or terms of use to shut down and kick off fake accounts, trolls, bots, et cetera. And in turn, a lot of times what will happen, and this is happening more and more, which is great, they're sending back to us new accounts they've identified that then allow us to have more leads to pursue more investigative activity. And so I mentioned one example in my opening statement that recently occurred where we were able to pass information to Facebook and Twitter. They were able to shut down Russian influence accounts really right before they could ever build a following. And the faster we can do that, and the more agile way we can do that, the better. And the reason for that, I think is important for people to understand. Misinformation or disinformation or fake information is only effective if it seems credible. And it's only credible if it's built up some reservoir of credibility, which means that these Russian efforts require a certain amount of time to build up kind of a reservoir of credibility so that when they're really active, people care what they have to say. And if we're able to shut them down and knock them back quickly before they can really build up that credibility, then it's not going to stop it, but it means that it's much, much less effective. So we need more of that. We're having more of that.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that assessment. Those were encouraging words. Can we conclude based upon your perspective, Director Ray, that the FBI does have an ongoing and functional relationship with the social media platforms to deter or to dismantle ultimately individual efforts by foreign nation states to sway the perspectives of the American people and to ultimately influence our elections? Are you comfortable with the kind of relationship and communications you're having with the social media giants?
Well, I guess the best way I could answer that is to say I tend to be ambitious for the organization and for the country, and so I think there's always room for improvement, and I'm always impatient for more progress and more improvement. But certainly the strides that we have made at the FBI working with some of those companies over the last few years it has really been very encouraging, and I think we're making great progress. I'd like to see more progress, including from them, but we're moving in the right direction for sure.
Gentleman's
Thank
time.
you, sir. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to begin by thanking Director Ray and Director Miller for your presence here today and for your testimony. Hearing from our nation's top law enforcement and Homeland Security officials on the enforcement of Homeland Security officials on the threats facing our country is of paramount importance to the American people. And I'd also like to note my profound disappointment that Mr. Wolf has declined to join you, and I associate myself with the chairman's remarks earlier on that topic. Director Ray, let me begin with you, and let me start on the topic on the Solarium Commission, in which I served as a commissioner, as did you. I want to thank you for your participation on the commission, as well as that of Deputy Director Bodwich on this commission. I'm very proud of the collaborative work that we did in developing recommendations, many of which I'm optimistic will become law by the end of the year. What are your observations, Director, on the final report, and which recommendations do you consider most pressing?
Well, first let me say I appreciated the opportunity to serve on the commission, and I commend my fellow commissioners, especially you and Senator King and others, for really pushing this topic before, hopefully, we have some truly apocalyptic cyber crisis in this country, and for not shying away for some very hard issues. I think there are several recommendations in the report that we really would think would benefit our cyber investigative and intelligence missions, and I think the commission was on the right track on that, including in particular, really highlighting and encouraging the government to double down on our national cyber joint investigative task force, the NCIJTF, that sort of brings a whole of government approach to the importance of attribution, which is so key. You also, I think the commission also highlighted a number of statutory gaps and inconsistencies. There's references to the need to update, for example, the pen register and trap and trace statute. There's references to administrative subpoena authority for computer intrusion cases. Those are a few things that jump out at me. Certainly, the highlighting.
That's good. My time is short, so let me jump to another topic. I also want to highlight the joint collaborative environment to allow analysts across government and the private sector work together, produce cyber threat intelligence products. So that's another important one. But let me turn to elections because this is a very important topic. We only have about 7 weeks to go until the election, and early voting begins Monday, and misinformation and disinformation from foreign and domestic actors are widespread, and we've discussed some of this topic already this morning. Director Ray, who is responsible for coordinating election security across the interagency? And to put it bluntly, who is in charge? And I also want to know who is responsible for coordinating efforts to combat election-related misinformation and disinformation. But take them in order there.
So the FBI takes the lead on malign foreign influence domestically, and we work closely with, through our Foreign Influence Task Force. We have people from NSA, for example, on our task force. We work very closely, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, with the social media companies, and that's a really almost daily engagement. And we engage through the Foreign Influence Task Force really every day, especially in the current run-up to the election, in the interagency on the malign foreign influence piece.
Who would you say is in charge at the interagency?
I'm sorry?
Who would you say is responsible for coordinating across the interagency? Who's in charge?
Well, we all work together, just as we do against the terrorist threat. It's an interagency process. We take the lead on the malign foreign influence threat. DHS takes the lead on the election infrastructure hardening. ODNI takes the lead in terms of coordinating the intelligence analysis that comes out of it.
And who's responsible for combating the election-related misinformation, disinformation?
I think the FBI takes the lead in combating that.
Well, this is, I appreciate your answer, your perspective. I know my time has run out, but I will say this really underscores the need for a national cyber director so that across response, we have someone that is identified as the person in charge. Working together is important. I highly support a collaborative environment, but also having someone in charge is essential. I know my time's expired, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back at this point. I'll have other questions for the record.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the young lady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both of you and all your employees for the hard work you do protecting our nation. Director Ray, when do you plan to declassify the 302s that were produced regarding the Ukraine election interference in the 2016 election?
I don't have an update for you on the timing of any specific declassification document, but I'm happy to see if there's information we can provide back to your office as a follow-up.
Thank you. Director Ray, as you know, IG Horowitz identified numerous major errors in the FISA court application process under the Obama administration's, I would classify it as spying on the Trump campaign. And so what status are we at in cleaning that whole process up?
So I appreciate the question. Let me say first that I think that report describes conduct that I consider unacceptable and unrepresentative of who I know the FBI to be as an organization. and it cannot be allowed to happen again. I've installed an entirely new leadership team. I put in place, on the same day the report came out, implemented over 40 corrective actions that accepted every recommendation in the IG's report and then went above and beyond. The senior-most people involved in that investigation are all gone, either terminated during my tenure or resigned or retired. And we're moving forward with changes to processes, training, oversight within the organization. We're creating a new Office of Internal Audit. You may have seen an announcement from the Attorney General on that. We've got his approval to do that, which will sort of provide the sort of the back-end check, the old sort of trust but verify. We'll get the verify part coming through that. So I'm very encouraged by the progress we're making, but you know, it's going to take hard work.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad that you appreciate it, because obviously to the average American person, including me, if the FBI can spy on an incoming president of the United States, every person in America is concerned that they will spy on them. And so I'm glad it's being cleaned up. I do have a question about Boogaloo. Recently, it's my understanding that 2 Americans self-identifying as members of the Boogaloo Boys were arrested for attempting to partner with Hamas due to their similar goals and missions. Have there been any arrests? How have these arrests modified the DHS and FBI approach to investigating and handling rioters and domestic terrorists?
So I appreciate your flagging that particular case. I think it's a very revealing, interesting case. It was a Minneapolis case. Those are 2 individuals who I think associated themselves with the Boogaloos, which, much like Antifa, is more of a movement or an ideology than it is a group itself. But I think one of the things a lot of people don't understand about people who subscribe to this sort of Boogaloo thinking is that their main focus is just dismantling, tearing down government. And they're less clear on what it is they think they're going to replace government with. I'm not even sure they would all agree with each other. And that's why this case in Minneapolis that you highlighted is so revealing, because these 2 individuals decided that they were on board with providing material support to Hamas, which is not something that most people would previously have associated with the Boogaloos.
It's very interesting. I do have one last question, only 49 seconds left. There have been statements by top people here. In fact, Chairman Nadler has said on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives that basically Antifa is a fantasy made up by the radical right or Fox News or something to that effect. Would you agree with that? Is Antifa a total fantasy, or is it real?
So Antifa is a real thing. It's not a group or an organization. It's a movement or an ideology, maybe one way of thinking of it. And we have quite a number, and I've said this consistently since my first time appearing before this committee. We have any number of properly predicated investigations into what we would describe as violent anarchist extremists, and some of those individuals self-identify with Antifa.
Thank you, sir, and I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, let me just express how disappointed I am that DHS is not here. Although, you know, there are real things that we need to know, especially in Louisiana, from DHS. We have wildfires, we have hurricanes. We need to know if FEMA has the funds to help our American citizens whose lives have been turned upside down. For those people in Lake Charles, Louisiana, that are in shelters in surrounding cities like New Orleans, we need to know what's FEMA's plan, Does DHS has the funds? Have the funds been moved over to build a wall? Now, look, fortunately for New Orleans, we were escaped this time from major damage. However, because of what Congress did for us after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, we continue to pay it forward. And even though my colleagues from Louisiana may not want to criticize DHS or the president, I will do it. We have people who are very vulnerable now, and we need to know what's the federal government's plan, the amount of money they have, and for DHS not to be here is sad. Let me start, Director Ray, really quick. You talked about movements and ideologies, but Black Lives Matter is more of a principle and an organization. And what I'd like to go into very quickly is that, do you all identify it as an extremist organization?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I'm having a little bit of a
I
hard
said
time
Black
with the
Lives
audio.
Matter is a principle, and it's also an organization. Do you all identify Black Lives Matter as an extremist organization?
We have not identified Black Lives Matter
Do you?
in any
Okay.
way.
Do you identify the organization as a violent organization or a threat to peace?
We have, as I said, we have not identified the organization in any way. We don't, unlike on the international terrorism side, the foreign terrorist side, there is no mechanism under U.S. law for us to, and we don't identify domestic organizations as anything really.
Well, Director Ray, I know that you hear all the time this whole mantra of law and order. And what I'm trying to do is get you to give some clarification, because things may get silly, dangerous, or foolish. And so my example would be posting on social media a comment that if armed Black people come to my city, I will drop 10 of them. That is dangerous rhetoric, especially when we see people exercising their right to carry arms that are white and that are Black. And for people to assume that the ones that are Black are a threat, that they can publicly say, I will drop 10 of you, is concerning. And I know that you, as one of our top law and order officials, should have some concern about that rising level of rhetoric and agitation.
Well, we are, I think, are very concerned about violence of any kind, including violence that deprives citizens of their constitutional rights and civil liberties. And certainly one of the concerns that we have amidst all the current unrest is a growing trend of protest begets counter-protest, begets violence against one side against the other. And so there's sort of this increasing phenomenon of individuals attacking each other in addition to attacking law enforcement, and that's not good for anybody.
Thank you, Director Ray. And really quickly, a lot of my mayors have called me from around the country that are saying, wait, the violence in the streets, the chaos, and the destruction of property, people are assigning to Black Lives Matter. And from our experience, what we're seeing is that is in fact not Black Lives Matter. Would you agree with that statement?
I don't think I would characterize it the way you're hearing. Certainly, I guess what I would say is, from one city to another, from one night to another, who's committing violence and destruction of property varies widely. Sometimes, certainly from city to city, sometimes from night to night. I think in general, what we're seeing across the country are sort of three groups, right? One is, three categories is maybe a better way of putting it. One is peaceful protesters, lawful peaceful protesters. A second is sort of what I would call criminal opportunists, people engaged in kind of state, local, low-level vandalism and looting and things like that. That's criminal activity, needs to be addressed largely a state and local matter. And then there's a third category, which is the most dangerous, and those are the people engaged in arsons of police vehicles, throwing of Molotov cocktails, those kinds of things. That's the group that we, FBI, are most focused on, most concerned about. And those groups are motivated by a wide variety of ideologies and agendas.
General,
Thank you, and I see my time is, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes, Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Thank you, Director Miller and Director Ray, for this important update on worldwide threats to our homeland. Director Ray, are you seeing a coordinated effort from radical anarcho left-wing organizations who are currently perhaps targeting law enforcement officers?
Well, as I said a few minutes ago, the violence varies widely. Much of the violence that we're seeing, it does not appear to be organized or attributed to any one particular group or even movement. That doesn't make it any less serious or criminal or unacceptable. Now, we are seeing in certain pockets more kind of regionally organized folks coalescing, often coordinating on the ground in the middle of protests, you know, in terms of tactics and things like that. And that is some of the most dangerous activity, because that's often what leads to destruction of small business, destruction of government buildings, and particularly concerning to me, you know, assaults on law enforcement and federal law enforcement officials in particular, but not exclusively. We've got case after case of people burning, setting fire, you know, pouring gasoline and setting fire to marked police vehicles. And this is not innocuous activity. And it takes a very, very, very special person to be willing to put his or her life on the line for complete strangers every day, which is what law enforcement in this country does. And even before all this latest activity, the rate of line of duty deaths was alarming. Then you add on top of that COVID, and COVID deaths for law enforcement continue because, of course, law enforcement doesn't have the ability to sit it out. And now we've seen a significant uptick in violence against law enforcement in this country this year. It's up markedly from last year. And the reason I know that, besides just looking at the statistics, is that I made it a practice after becoming FBI director to, every time there is an officer shot and killed in this country, to personally call the chief or sheriff responsible for that officer and express my condolences and support on behalf of the FBI. And I will tell you, we had a stretch just recently, late August, early September, I think it was, maybe even more recently than that, where over a 15-day stretch, I made 7 of those phone calls. That's an officer feloniously killed every other day. And these are people, you know, average age is in their late 30s. They had their whole lives ahead of them. They had families, and it breaks my heart.
I applaud you for connecting with local law enforcement when these tragedies occur. You and I realize that these men and women bravely, every day, put on the uniform to protect us. Continuing along this line, has there been any assistance from social media companies to help weed out potential threats when these organizations are using their platforms?
Well, somewhat like what I was describing in response to a question earlier on the election influence context or threat, we do have relationships with the social media companies in which, again, in a similar way, they will sometimes detect activity on their platforms and working jointly with us, they will sometimes use their terms of use or terms of service to shut down or kick off those accounts and flag information for law enforcement. So any assistance, I would say yes, some assistance. It varies, you know, a bit from company to company. Some of them devote more resources to that kind of operation which supports law enforcement than others. But we do certainly have a number of engagements with, or partnerships almost, with some of those companies.
And finally, do you see any foreign governments attempting to communicate with these organizations or assist any political party within them?
I'm sorry, which organizations are we talking about now?
With these left-wing organizations, which I think are behind so much of the attacks on law enforcement?
Well, I guess I would answer that in two parts. One, we have seen some efforts by our foreign adversaries. I would mention China and Russia specifically, but not exclusively, to sort of piggyback on a lot of the unrest activity that's been occurring as part of the effort either to sow divisiveness and discord in the case of the Russians, or to try to advance their own narratives, say in the case of the Chinese. So there's that level of kind of engagement. And then I would say the second piece is maybe not the organizations you're talking about, but we have seen some engagement between racially motivated violent extremists and like-minded individuals overseas on that front.
Thank you for your insights, and thank you for your update.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor and privilege to be here today with a committee. And let me first say to Mr. Ray and Mr. Miller that I appreciate you understanding your obligation to show up when the committee requests your appearance as opposed to the empty chair that is there. And let me ask Mr. Ray, is there a, so with Antifa, you're saying it's more of an ideology than an organized group, you know, which, you know, a lot of people, you know, on the other side feel is some organized group. Is it an organized group, or is it more just a notion of thought, of philosophy with respect to this? Because, you know, when I hear this, you know, Antifa is there, or Antifa is doing this, I'm still trying to figure out who and what Antifa is. Could you enlighten me?
Well, first let me say, as I think I said in response to an earlier question, Antifa is a real thing. It's not a fiction, but it is. It's not an organization or a structure. We view it more as we understand it to be more of a kind of a movement, or maybe you could call it an ideology. And we certainly have, as I've said, a number of, and we have had for some time, and we've opened quite a number this year, of improperly predicated investigations into violent anarchist extremists who subscribe to, self-identify with Antifa. They say, you know, I am Antifa, you know, things like that. And we have seen individuals, I think I've mentioned this in response to one of the earlier questions, identified with the Antifa movement, coalescing regionally into what you might describe as small groups or nodes, and we are actively investigating the potential of violence from those regional nodes, if you will.
Thank you. Congressman, you might need to unmute yourself. We've been advised that we're having some issues with WebEx right now. We're trying to correct them. We'll stand by.
Okay.
Gentleman from New Jersey may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there, did Mr. Ray, did you finish your response?
I finished my response, but I'm not sure whether you're still online while I finished. I'd be happy to pick up where I left if you could tell me where you lost contact.
Well, I think I got the gist of your response. So I'll move on. Mr. Miller, the past 4 years have seen the United States significantly scale back its presence and commitments around the world. Our NATO allies no longer trust us to keep our commitments, leaving the door open for other forces to step into this vacuum. And as we've seen time and again, instability leads to violence. Is the National Counterterrorism Center planning for the effects of a global leadership vacuum?
Thank you, sir, for that question. I've been so impressed. I've been doing this for a few years, and the most amazing thing is the partnerships we have internationally on the counterterrorism front, and I have seen no degradation in our commitment and our partnerships in that regards. As a matter of fact, oftentimes it's almost one of those. During the Cold War, we said foreign policy ended at the water's edge. It's very much the same way with counterterrorism now. We're obviously concerned about drawing back from our commitments overseas, but we maintain a robust, very significant counterterrorism presence overseas, and we have the ability to generate combat power and deploy that forward if there's an enemy, a terrorist group that is in a position to threaten us.
Do you believe that the United States is acting as a global leader should?
As you noted, we're in a great transformation geopolitically and geostrategically. From the counterterrorism aspect, I talk with all my partners regularly with our Five Eyes, and I feel very confident that we maintain a close relationship and partnership and leadership role.
Gentleman from New Jersey's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a doggy in the background. It sounds like first, I'd note that the petty game about who from the Department of Homeland Security testifies today must be amazing to Americans outside the Beltway. This is the annual hearing on worldwide threats to the homeland, and I can't, for one, imagine setting aside that priority in order to engage in a snit with the department about whether Mr. Wolf or Mr. Cuccinelli appears. So we have neither. And in light of that, I'll direct questions, Director Ray, to you. All summer and early fall, of course, we've seen numerous and ongoing riots, looting, property destruction, even serious injuries and killings in cities across the United States. Minneapolis, LA, Seattle, Charleston, Chicago, St. Louis, Washington, D.C., Rochester, Lancaster, and of course, Portland come to mind. And we've seen some media characterize these events as fiery but mostly peaceful, and politicians have dismissed them occasionally as myth. But Americans have seen independent reports and shocking videos, and they keep coming. I don't really understand the thinking of lawmakers who seek perversely to justify this criminality by pointing to the existence of other violent extremists with different ideology. I would think all elected officials would condemn violence regardless of the ideology of the perpetrators, and perhaps especially for ideologies closer to their position on the spectrum. But indeed, as Ms. Lesko pointed out earlier, the characterization of right and left in these things is pretty hard to pin down. In any event, some of these reports, even early on, have suggested that there were pallets of brick pre-positioned in riot areas. We've seen reports of vehicles on scene to facilitate or supply rioters. coordination of activity via social media you made reference to earlier, and interstate travel of rioters to multiple venues. All of these in turn suggest a funding source or multiple funding sources. You have made reference, as has the Attorney General, to numerous arrests having been made. Are you investigating sources of funding in support of that criminal activity?
I appreciate the question. And certainly, we have a number of investigations and are pursuing a number of leads that do things like try to identify networks, travelers, supply sources. We look at repeat offenders. As I mentioned, I think in response to a question from one of your colleagues, one of the things that's been so challenging about this is that an awful lot of the coordination or whether it's coordination or organization, if you will, that occurs is happening kind of on the ground, you know, in the dark, on the streets, at a tactical level, as opposed to kind of on a more structured or coordinated national level, and that makes it that much harder to investigate and disrupt. But I think it's important for people to understand that although I do agree that the majority of the people out there protesting in general across the country are peaceful protesters, there's no question that the biggest number is peaceful protesters. That should not diminish, which I think is the point you're making, from the fact that even though it might numerically be a smaller group, that's very dangerous activity that smaller group is engaged in. And that's why the FBI is focused, much as your question was, we're focused on the violence, not the ideology. We don't really care left, right. Violence is wrong. We're going after the violence. We don't care what motivates them.
To be sure, those issues ought to be irrelevant to this committee or to any law enforcement agency in the United States. That is to say, what ideology someone has or their First Amendment activity. And to say, so that much of that happening is frankly something that we should take no cognizance of. But as to those people who are engaging in violence and destruction, and there have been many, the question becomes, with its proliferation in so many places, is the FBI examining the finances underlying the people who you arrest to see what their Venmo accounts say, to see what the sources of cash are that come to them that they're buying their supplies with and their fireworks that they fire at law enforcement officers? And are you using civil forfeiture laws to disrupt those sources of funding and the like?
Well, without reference to any specific investigation, I can tell you that there are any number of investigations in which the source of funding, the source of supply, are things that are of particular interest and the things that we're actively questioning and pursuing leads on. As far as the civil forfeiture piece, I will confess that sitting here right now in the hearing, I can't off the top of my head think of a situation where we've yet been able to use that, but we will use every tool in our toolbox if we think it fits.
My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the young lady from New York for 5 minutes, Ms. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miller, late last month, your boss, the Director of National Intelligence, Ratcliffe, said the Office of the Director of National Intelligence would cease in-person election security briefings to Congress. Then just yesterday, he reversed that decision and said that he will continue to brief the Senate and House Intel committees on efforts to secure the 2020 elections from foreign interference, but will no longer conduct briefings for all lawmakers, citing the need to protect intelligence sources and methods. It's incredibly frustrating that a nonpartisan issue like the security of our elections has been so politicized that members of Congress are now considered untrustworthy of this critical information. It's also particularly alarming that this information is being withheld from members of Congress only weeks after DHS confirmed publicly that Russia was working to boost President Trump, again by discrediting Vice President Biden's health. Will you commit to us that the ODNI will continue to keep all members of Congress informed on election security threats? And if your answer is yes, how do you plan on doing that?
Ma'am, with all respect, I don't do election security. Absolutely, we'll provide any information you require, the Congress requires on terrorism matters, but that really is a decision that's been being made at the DNI level. And my center, we just do counterterrorism, ma'am.
Well, maybe you can take the message back to your boss, because
Yes, ma'am.
to say that members of Congress are not worthy to be trusted with this information when it's actually our job to have this information and to have some level of oversight is really disturbing.
Yes, ma'am, I'd be happy to take that message back.
Thank you. Mr. Ray, recently the Department of Justice and federal partners conducted the largest ever seizure of terrorist organizations' cryptocurrency accounts, seizing in total 300 accounts allegedly used by foreign terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Hamas to fund attacks. Out of this committee, we passed a bipartisan bill that would require DHS to develop and submit a threat assessment report on the use of virtual currencies by terrorist organizations. This version of the bill was included in the NDAA and signed into law just this past December. This case demonstrates the adaptability of terrorist groups who have traditionally used unlicensed money services businesses or other money laundering operations to adopt their terror finance activities to the cyber age. In your opinion, will cryptocurrencies continue to be used by these terrorist organizations on a wider basis? What trends are you and your respective department seeing in this matter?
Well, Congresswoman, I agree with you that cryptocurrency is a source of particular concern. It's proliferating not just across terrorist threats, but across other kinds of criminal threats as well. And within the terrorism space, both across international terrorists and domestic, and it makes it one of the key investigative tools that we have, one of the key investigative strategies that we have in that space, much as was in the answer that I just gave to Congressman Bishop, is to follow the money. That's one of our go-to moves. And of course, the ability to follow the money is critical across every threat, and the cryptocurrency makes it that much harder for us to do that. We have developed a lot of expertise on that, but each time we sort of solve one kind of cryptocurrency, a new kind comes on the market. And part of the reason why this is such a big deal is that it fits with other technological trends which have a similar kind of effect of hiding and obstructing criminal activity from law enforcement. So if you think about any investigation we have, you've got the stuff, the documents, the communications, you got the people, the witnesses, the sources, human sources, and you got the money. Well, if cryptocurrency hides the money, if default end-to-end encryption blocks us from any kind of lawful access to the stuff, and if artificial intelligence and all the various ways in which technology makes it easier to find human sources, makes it harder for us to protect human sources, then we lose the money, the people, and the stuff. And that's when we're in a really bad space as a country, from protecting us from terrorist threats all the way to organized criminal threats and others.
Can I ask you to just talk a little bit more? You made reference earlier in response to a question about the collaboration that your agency has with social media platforms in terms of misinformation and disinformation. Can you just talk more about that? Because if people can't trust the information that they're getting, I mean, that just goes to the heart of, really affecting, what I think all of us on this committee want to do, which is everyone's right and ability to vote and base their decisions on facts, not misinformation and disinformation.
So this is one of our key challenges, both for the FBI and for the interagency and for the country. Misinformation, disinformation is not new, but what is new is the ability through social media to amplify it at scale in a much more challenging way. That's why the partnerships with the private sector and with Silicon Valley, the tech companies, et cetera, has become so critical to our efforts. There are things that they can do, and they have resources to take responsibility for things that are happening on their own platforms much more quickly and within greater legal flexibility under their terms of use and terms of service than we could do through law enforcement means. And so that's why that's part of the key effort. Now, we, the FBI, are not and can't be the truth police. And a lot of people don't understand that that is not how we go about deterring misinformation efforts and malign foreign influence efforts. We follow the threat. So if it's the Russians, we follow the Russian actors. If we identify certain accounts, we talk to the social media companies. They take action. But we don't have people sitting on social media trying to find things that look false and then wondering who did it. We go the other way. We look at the actor and then see what they're trying to spread. The social media companies, though, they can come at it in whatever way they want based on their terms of service. And they have resources that I envy sometimes, that they can and should and are increasingly bringing to the fight. It's particularly of concern to us in the election context when Americans make the mistake of getting information about elections themselves from social media. So it's one thing to push out misinformation about a candidate or a policy or something else, but when information gets pushed out about where you go to vote, whether your polling place is open, whether it's closed, that kind of thing, we're trying to make sure Americans know to get information about where and when and how you vote, you need to go to your local election official's website and don't take it from social media.
Thank you both for being here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for moving us into a much cooler room.
Yeah, much cooler.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Director Ray, for being here. I'd like to ask you about a number of things, China, Iran, Russia. The thing is I think politically there's not that much daylight between us on these issues. We largely agree on these threats. What there seems to be disagreement over, politically speaking, is the source of the domestic threats that we're facing, the vast amount of looting, rioting, and destruction that's occurred in our country over the last few months. I don't understand why we disagree on these origins, but we do. There's been a lot of peaceful protests. That is absolutely true. There's also been more than 550 declared riots, many stoked by extremists in Antifa and the BLM organization. A recent report indicated between $1 and $2 billion of insurance claims will be paid out. That doesn't even come close to measuring the actual and true damage done to people's lives. Not even close. That's just insurance. We've heard multiple reports of small businesses without any insurance whatsoever. Some of these will never open up, even if they did get insurance payments. And I've heard many members of this body, of this committee, question whether Antifa even exists. Director Ray, earlier you confirmed Antifa does indeed exist, but you considered it more of an ideology than a group, correct?
Yes, an ideology or maybe a movement.
Okay. That seems to me to be downplaying it. And this is an ideology that organizes locally. It coordinates regionally and nationally. It wears a standardized uniform. It collects funds to buy high-powered lasers to blind federal officers, build homemade explosive devices, feed their rioters, since they clearly aren't working, and then bail out those who've been arrested. This is an ideology that has trained its members, makes shield wall phalanxes to attack federal officers. It formed an autonomous zone in an American city and besieged a federal courthouse in another. So, I mean, it just seems to be more than an ideology. Do you have a way to define what you mean by it's not a group?
So I want to be clear that by describing it as an ideology or movement, I by no means mean to minimize the seriousness of the violence and criminality that is going on across the country, some of which is attributable to that people inspired by or who self-identify with that ideology and movement. We're focused on that violence, on that criminality, and some of it is extremely serious.
And you mentioned before 3 categories, the criminality, the peaceful protesting, but then, and you didn't use these words, but I will, ideological rioting. I think that sort of matches that 3rd category of what you said, the people who purposefully want to instigate it, Antifa being clearly one of them. So I want to read you the definition of domestic terrorism. Section 2331 says, domestic terrorism has 3 components. A, involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state. B, appear to be intended First, to intimidate or coerce a civilian population. 2, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. Or 3, to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. And C, occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. Does that at all match the activities of Antifa?
Well, certainly matches the activity of some of the individuals we're investigating and have pursued other kinds of charges against. You put your finger on a little bit of a legal predicament, which is that there is not currently in Title 18 a domestic terrorism offense or crime as such. There's a definition.
It seems pretty specific.
Well, there's a definition, but ironically, there's not a, unlike on the international foreign terrorist side, there's not a crime of domestic terrorism that you can charge. So typically, we, in domestic terrorism cases, including of the sort you're describing, we're pursuing explosive charges, firearms charges, rioting charges you mentioned, or other.
Are you prevented from, say, following the money, following the websites that these groups are clearly organizing? Again, it seems strange to me that we can't call it a group.
We're not precluded from following the money, and as I said to Congressman Bishop, we have a number of investigations where we're chasing.
One more question before my time runs out.
There's not a material support to offense like there is. We could do material support to Al-Qaeda or ISIS. There's not a material support to a domestic terrorism.
One more question. The FBI's civil rights investigation can target law enforcement officials who willfully fail to keep the public from harm in violation of the color of law statute. Does that apply to mayors and city councils who have restrained their police departments, such as Mayor Wheeler in Portland, Mayor de Blasio in New York, and the Minneapolis City Council?
Well, respectfully, I think that's a legal question that I would want to defer to the Attorney General and Department of Justice on whether that would apply there.
Thank you. I yield my time.
I think the chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses today, Director Ray, Director Miller, for being here today. I want to thank all the good folks that work under you in your agencies for keeping us in this country safe and keeping our families safe as well. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman Thompson, also for holding this most important hearing. And your focus today is the central topic of this Homeland Security, which is keeping this country secure. One of the purposes of this committee is to assess international as well as domestic threats to this country. One of those threats right now, biggest one I hear about much in my district is election security. But not only are foreign actors threatening to, again, interfere with our election, but there's a lot of concern in my district about peaceful transition of power in this country. That's been the hallmark of our democracy. And a lot of my constituents are concerned that if President Trump loses in November, he will not relinquish power and he will try to stay in office. I'm reminded of Al Gore, who lost the election in the year 2000 by a ruling of 5-4, United States Supreme Court. I'm saddened that Mr. Wolf is not here today because I wanted to ask him a few questions, yes or no. And what I really wanted from Mr. Wolf was I wanted to ask him to make the same commitment as General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs, made. And I'm going to quote him, open quote. And General Milley said, "I believe deeply in the principle of an apolitical U.S. military. In the event of a dispute over some aspect of the elections, by law, U.S. courts and the U.S. Congress are required to resolve any disputes, not the military, and I foresee no role for the U.S. Armed Forces in this process." And I was hoping that Mr. Wolf would also take that pledge. And Mr. Chairman, since he's not here, I'd like to submit for the record that these questions in writing, and hopefully you can get them to him and he will respond to them.
Without objection.
And gentlemen, I have a question for both of you. Sometime in mid-August, the Senate Intelligence Committee released its fifth and final version, or volume, I should say, regarding the Russian interference into the 2016 election. That Senate report found that Manafort passed sensitive campaign information to Russian intelligence officers. And my question to both of you is, are you monitoring to make sure that it's not only foreign interference into our elections, but rather that campaigns here in the U.S. are not trying to ask or solicit foreign support by foreign countries of domestic campaigns? Question.
Well, certainly we pursue what I would call foreign influence investigations, both with respect to election interference in the sense that that was described in the Senate in the Sisi report, but also in terms of political corruption or illegal campaign financing cases and things like that. Some of those are criminal investigations. Some of those are even counterintelligence investigations in certain scenarios, I can imagine. So we certainly have a number of people working on those kinds of matters, and that's a threat that we take very seriously as part of our overall effort to protect not just our elections, but our democracy from foreign interference and influence.
Mr. Miller?
Sir, in accordance with statute, that's beyond the remit of the National Counterterrorism Center. We focus on linkages of international terrorist organizations into domestically, but have no role in that, and I'm not completely familiar with all the ins and outs, sir.
I'm running out of time. Very quickly, Mr. Miller. Then, under your definition of terrorism, how does the concept of foreign interference of our elections, foreign manipulation of our democracy fit into the concept of terrorism?
Sir, we focus on acts of violence committed against American citizens to affect political change from an international context only. When you talk about influence and whatnot, that's a different category that doesn't fall within our remit, sir.
The Chairman, I'm out of time. I yield.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey for 5 minutes, Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. Just very briefly, I wanted to go back to the Antifa issue. So if we have an organization that is able to communicate among different counties, different states, different areas, different cities, is able to organize when Black Lives Matter also organize at the same time, advertises for people to help them and they will pay them, feeds them, as was said so eloquently before, and takes care of them. That to me would be more than just a loosely knit group of people. I mean, I guess we want to define this a little bit, that there, in my mind, there is Antifa, there's a group or individuals that control Antifa and have some authority over it, and it is to some degree, without question, organized. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think what I would say is that we have seen folks who subscribe to or self-identify with the Antifa movement who coalesce regionally into what we refer to or think of as more as small groups or nodes, and they're certainly organized at that level, those individuals.
Not to interrupt you,
Yeah.
But for example, and I understand that some people self-identify as communists, yet there is a real communist organization that is organized at the same time.
Right. I think I'm not sure I'm seeing the rest.
So what I'm saying to you, maybe to clarify a little bit more, is just because some people self-identify doesn't mean that there is more of an organizational aspect to this, that there's something out there that deserves a very thorough investigation.
Well, on the last part, I would say we are very thoroughly investigating, and as I mentioned, we have quite a number of properly predicated investigations being conducted by our joint terrorism task forces around the country into violent anarchist extremism. And any number of those involve people who are tied, either by their own admission or otherwise, to the Antifa movement. And in some cases, we see those individuals working together in a tactical, organized way. And so the investigation in those instances might be more of what we might call an enterprise investigation.
Let me ask you this question. Black Lives Matters, which are good words. Black lives do matter. Black babies, black parents, mothers and grandfathers and fathers and human beings and human souls. So there's nothing wrong with those words, yet it is emblematic of an organization that is Marxist. You just get your Google out, look it up. It's a Marxist organization, and it is all